Now it gives me great pleasure to welcome Paul Walde. Please join me.
Susan asked me to talk about the use of music and sound in my work, so I'm going to really focus in on a few key pieces and a little bit of background. So there's a couple of transitional pieces that I'll throw in there as well. I've got some video and I've got some audio. And hopefully we can squeeze in quite a bit of it. So I'm going to show this slide. It's, Susan mentioned I was living in New York. I lived there in the early to mid-90s. And while I was there, I became aware that the environment was very different than the environment that I grew up in. I grew up in Northern Ontario. I went to school here at Western. And when I got to New York, there was not a lot of nature, and was really interested in how my experience with the landscape differed from the urban environment. And so on one of my trips back to Canada, I've been doing a lot of woodcut printing, and I was talking to Charles, one of the grad students today, about his woodcuts, and I was spending a lot of time making these very elaborate printmaking plates. And really at a certain point I realized that I was making plates and not prints, so I just wanted to start looking around my environment to start making, using found materials. And so on one of my trips to Northern Ontario, I found this piece of plywood that was gnawed by porcupines. And that kind of got me going in a whole different direction. It seems kind of silly, but this is one of these small prints, and it took me a long time to develop the methodology, how to print this way, how to prepare these plates, and but it really changed my whole vision of art making. I wasn't so concerned about my own hand at that point, and I started really becoming interested in forms in nature and how they could be brought into a cultural context. So this was a transitional period, and it was my first work that got shown in Canada when I came back, and immediately after that, I originally thought I was going to be making paintings, so I was trained as a painter and printmaker primarily. And so I made this installation. This is around the year 2000 to 2001. And the reason I'm showing this is because it's the first piece that I use sound in. I wanted to find different ways to interpret this information that I was finding in the woods. So a beaver took down a tree right in front of my studio. And I thought, I have to do something with this. So I cast the length of the tree. And so if you see, I'll show you another slide, but at the very top of this image, there's a plaster frieze, and that's the castings off this tree. And originally I thought I was going to make a painting. And I took the castings inside and laid them out on the table and prepared to art on them somehow. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do. But some of the markings reminded me of musical notation, and then I had a dream of this thing being installed, and that there was an outhouse, and that there was a DJ booth, and then I thought I need to do something with this. So and it was all from wondering about these music notes. If I could translate the marks that the beaver left on this tree into music notation. There's other elements in this installation. There's a genuine outhouse from the cottage that I was working at that's been drywalled and turned into a mini gallery, and I had a little retrospective of my work, and that's a double reference to Marcel Duchamp's, both his fountain and the boîte and valise. And then these beaver sticks were hand-printed or hand-finished beaver sticks. So this idea of sticks and furniture and trying to make them more domestic. And then I made this, blew up some of these marks and printed them onto commercial wallpaper. So those are all the elements that are in here. So there's the outhouse. It's got track lighting, and now it's got its own floor. Originally it didn't have a floor. Now it packs flat. And, so this is the piece of wood, or the plaster cast of the wood that reminded me of music notation. And you can see the bark looks like music staff. And I've got a diagram of how I did a translation. So I translated it into this drawing on the staff paper first, and then I translated those marks into notes. Then I spread it out across the staff, and then I used scoring software to input it. And at the time I didn't know there was scoring software. I had to ask one of my students who was involved in electronic music. I said, do they make make things for the computer that you can put music notes in and then make a sound out of it after? And he said, yeah, you can do that. And so I got a demo of this software and put it in. I had to borrow his computer. I didn't have a computer at the time. So then this is how I got started. And so I decided to score for a string quartet. I wanted to have something that was a cultural referent. And it seemed very audacious and, to take this on, because I didn't have any experience scoring music before. I'd studied music as a kid. A lot of people take piano lessons when they're a kid, and I did that, but I hadn't done any music, and I certainly hadn't included sound in my work at all. So this is where it started, and I'll play a little clip of the audio. Hopefully it's not too loud. So this is the first page that you're seeing here. So for this installation, I wanted to animate the space somehow. So one of the other things that happened in this piece was that I invited people to do remixes, and it's a piece called Northern Symphony. And so I managed to connect with an experimental musician. He now is an art writer, Terrence Dick, who writes for Kimbo magazine, does all their Kimbo blog, I think it's called. Yeah, and so Terrence invited all these other musicians to come and do remixes at the gallery. So while the show was on, every Saturday there was a remix session. And the way this kind of came about, partly I wanted to see if I could, my first idea was to write the music to vinyl, which we did. We got a dub plate made. But the other thing was that, and I didn't know this about music scoring, is that you can output these things as a MIDI file, and MIDI stands for musical instrument digital interface. So these little music files that are instructions, but you can give them to other musicians and they can assign different instruments to them. And so this was revelatory to me as well. And so people came and did these remixes. There's Terrence doing a full DJ set. But I love the idea that people could do stuff with the computer files as well. So these were two of my students at the time, and I'll play a little clip. And this is using the same bit of music that you heard before. So they're assigning it to different instruments, sticking beats under it. They're almost dueling with one another. That was the first time I had sound in any piece, and I didn't know about sound art. It wasn't something I was educated in. We didn't have classes on sound at Western, and when I went to grad school, we didn't even have sound. And so I just kind of stumbled into this thing, and began to realize that there was other people doing this stuff, and that other artists had made compositions, and but it's really a whole new thing for me to do. The other thing I want to talk about is proposals and the use of scoring, the proposal as a score. So a lot of my work now, this is how I will start something. I'll start with a short description of something, and maybe make a diagram. this was during a period I was without a studio, and I took a residency at the BAM Center. And one of the things that happens at the BAM Center is that they stick you in the same, at the time anyway, it's about over a decade ago, they used to stick you at the same table for dinner with the scientists. So we'd have these conversations. Well, actually, they wouldn't talk to us at first. The artists would sit on one side of the table, and the scientists would sit there, and they'd have their own conversation. And eventually, I said, I'm going to ask these guys questions about what they're doing. And they were all, a lot of them had their funding from the oil and gas industry. So these guys were trying to find oil and gas, and started asking about how they did that. And one of the things they use is these geophones, which are these seismic sensors, and they pound the ground and they get these readings. And so I became, interested in ways to create proposals, perhaps visionary proposals that may or may not be realizable. I didn't know whether it was possible or not. And so this is how I started introducing science into my work, was asking these questions, can we do that? Can we do this? And just allowing my mind to dance around on these ideas. And then I write them down. So that's one thing I encourage all my students to do, is when you have an idea, just write it down. And those things become, the kernels of ideas. Not everyone's going to see those ideas, but you can jump from one idea to the other, and eventually you will end up making things that may be possible. So this is one using my first idea, using a lowrider car, and those are these cars that have these hydraulic systems that can jump up and down and pound the ground and make a landscape image. And this one's never been realized. Here's another one that came at the same time. This is using a heavy metal drummer and seismic sensor, so having it super amplified so that those shock waves are going into the ground, and perhaps again creating a landscape image from this. So I'd really like to do this one day if someone hears about it and wants to do something. And I like this idea that ideas can have currency. You can move ideas out. So this is one that was realizable. This is when by this time I was living in London here, and I started dragging drums out into the park that was behind our house and making videos. And so this was a drum kit that sat in the rain. In London, we used to get some really violent thunderstorms, probably still do in the summer. So I did a series during all 4 seasons. Some are in the snow. This is a spring one. I've got one in a tornado. The tornado hit Durham a few years ago. I was out there. It's crazy. Anyway, so these were really interesting drum solos in which no one's playing. And this was really, this move towards sound. And this is another follow-up idea. So it started with this idea of the heavy metal drummer playing the landscape, and then I wanted the landscape to play the drums. And then this piece, I think, was more successful. This is one that I did at the Electric Eclectics Festival, which if you haven't gone there, it's a great festival in Meaford, Ontario, a few hours north of here. And this is using large floor toms from a drum kit with clear heads, lights shining up through the drums, and the lights attract insects. And using a DMX controller, I could control where the lights were going. And the drums are all tuned differently so that insects will come and land on different drums. And the other thing I discovered, and this is another application of scientific principles, and I'm not really a scientist, but I read a lot of science papers, and I never know if these things are going to work. But they start with a little proposal, and then sometimes people take me up on them, and then I have to do them. So this was one of those cases. I wrote a grant with a proposal, got the grant, applied for the show, and then had to do the show. So I still didn't know if this was going to work, but I'd read somewhere that moths developed ears to evade bats. And so I wanted to know if bats would evade the sound of bats, even if it wasn't coming out of a bat. So I got field recordings of bats and ran them through the same sound system. So these drums were highly amplified, and so they were highly amplified enough that you could hear small insects scuttling across the surface of the drums. And periodically, one of these field recordings of the bats would come, and then the moths would drop onto the drum. So somewhere, here's another image. And that's the score. So those are all the different drums, and this is what I use to program the DMX controller. So the lights go on, lights go off, and each one of those little marks represents when one is off or not. And so I could choreograph these different shapes and think about the different sounds that might be possible. So there's one. And this one you can actually see the insects. It's a longer exposure. You can see them kind of flying down towards the drums. There's a bigger one. And that's a large insect. And I think I have a sound sample on here. We'll see if that works. In case you've ever wondered what moths landing on a drum sounds like. So that hissing sound is the sound of the bat field recordings. Okay, so I'm going to take a moment to talk about John Cage. So John Cage, how many people know who John Cage is? Some of you? Do they learn about John Cage in art now? They will tonight, okay. So John Cage is an American composer. He's most famous for a piece of music that he wrote called 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And it's famous because it's a piece of music that has no notes. And he created this piece in 1952, and he's influential for many reasons. I'll talk about a few other, but he really pioneered the thinking that's fundamental to sound art, that anything could be music. You know, he introduced noise into composition, so there's real crossover. He was also very influential to the Fluxus artists, and I think Susan's going to be talking about them tonight, right? Or you did talk about them? You're talking about Fluxus artists tonight. So a lot of the Fluxus artists were in his class. He taught a class at the New School in the late 50s. And a lot of the founding members, Dick Higgins, Yoko Ono, who else was in it? Allison Knowles. They all took this class called composition. And so he was really opening up what composition could be, and it was really popular with these artists. And the term intermedia comes from Dick Higgins, who was one of Cage's students. This idea of creating new disciplines that are crosses between other disciplines. So you take art and music, and you have sound art. You take theater and art, and you have performance art. So these things are all bona fide disciplines now, but they weren't at the time, and it was really a way for them to step away from modernism. So Cage has been incredibly influential. One of the things I always wondered was what 4 minutes and 33 seconds sounded like. You know, I heard about it when I was a student. I always thought, what would it have been like to be there? And so I did some research and subsequently found out that 4 minutes and 33 seconds was not performed in New York City. I'd always just assumed that it was in a concert hall in New York City, and you could hear people rustling around in their seats. But no, it was performed in Maverick Hall, which is in Woodstock, near Woodstock, New York. It's in the middle of the bush. These doors that are at the back, this is a picture of the concert hall, they open out. Most of the people sit outside. It's the middle of summer. It's in the middle of the bush. And so when I found out that that's where it was, I thought, this would sound very interesting, and it wouldn't be silent. So the way that 4 minutes and 33 seconds is talked about is that it's silent. Cage would always say that there's no such thing as silence. So the sounds that are happening during the composition while it's being performed are the intentional sounds. So whatever happens, if people are coughing or, but when this happened, you know, it rained that evening. There was rain hitting the metal roof. There was wind in the trees, and there's a lot of bugs. So I got permission to go and make a recording on the anniversary of it was the 60th anniversary of the premiere performance in 33 seconds. On the 20th anniversary, the year of the 20th anniversary of Cage's death, but also the anniversary of his 100th anniversary of his birth, and I thought for sure something's going to be going on there, but there wasn't. And so I got to do this thing, and I think I should play, so I'll play a little bit of this for you. So not silent. And apparently this is no one had asked this question before, what performance in 3 seconds might it sound like. So it was somewhat startling to some Cage scholars. This is another piece that's influenced by Cage. Cage was also an expert mycologist. He was an amateur mycologist. He formed the New York Mycology Society in New York, and made a lot of work about mushrooms. So I wanted to make a piece that was dedicated to Cage. I've been working with forms of nature. So going back to that first slide that I showed you with the porcupine knot plywood, that same year I started experimenting with mushroom spore prints. So I was interested in all the different ways that I could make a print using things from my local environment. And one of them was mushroom spores. And very early on, I had wondered about this idea of creating a musical composition. And I didn't know at the time, but there's a whole school of music scoring using what's known as graphic notation. So graphic notation is an alternative form of music notation. So instead of using a standard staff and the little black dots for notes, you use visuals. And so Cage was also involved with that. One of his colleagues, Morton Feldman, was the first American to use graphic notation, and Cage was the first person that got to see it. And from that point on, Cage also started using graphic notation quite heavily in his work. So this is using mushroom spores as a score, and I got the mushrooms on a trip to California, which is not far from where Cage was born, and made this score. And so there's several panels, there's 8 panels in all, and there's a series of instructions on how to play this. So most graphic notation has very deliberate instructions about how to interpret the shapes. So for example, the size of the mushroom spore print is played a certain way. The height on the canvas, the panel, affects the height of the pitch. The clarity affects the articulation. Some close-ups. I'll play a little segment of what it sounds like being played, performed. So this is another spin-off, similar idea. This one I was curious to find out what the sound of mushroom spores dropping would sound like. I found this Cage quote. I do a lot of reading about Cage, in which he said, "There's no such thing as silence," and in fact, I'm sure that mushrooms and dropping their spores make a sound that you'd have to be in an anechoic chamber to hear it. And then he says he imagines it must be like gamelan music. So it was in a radio interview. And he said it would be lovely to hear that. So I thought it would be interesting to try to make this happen. So I worked with an engineer and used this thing called a laser vibrometer, which is a laser beam that acts as a microphone and can detect very, very, very small sounds. So we did this experiment. We don't actually know if it's mushroom spores dropping. I'm going to repeat the experiment. But we had some interesting results, so I'll play a short clip. The spores are visible because of the secondary laser beam that we ran across the surface. So you can see, you want to see that spores were actually dropping, so we knew what to look for. And a lot of these videos are on my website, so I won't play them all. Okay. So those are a few works that are influenced by John Cage and John Cage's work. I'm going to go into a little more detail on this piece. This is the piece that Susan was talking about in the introduction, Requiem for Glacier. I guess it was before I moved to BC. I got a call from this small gallery in Caslow, British Columbia. And they have a small cultural center, and they wanted to bring in Northern Symphony, one of the first pieces I showed with the outhouse and everything. And they called me up and said, we'd like to do a show, and I said, that would be great, and this is how much it costs to ship, and this is how many crates there are, and they said, we can't afford that. And I said, well, can we do something else? And maybe I can make a new piece, maybe we can apply for some funding. And I'd never been to that part of the world before, and I thought it'd be a great opportunity to go and work in a new landscape. And so I looked at a map, I saw that Lake Kootenai was there, and I thought that would be interesting. It's a very deep, narrow lake. I thought I'd make a piece about that. And the Kootenai Glacier is close by, and I said, is it possible when I come up there we can go and visit this glacier? And she said, well, if you want to make a piece about a glacier, we got to go to Jumbo. And the Jumbo Glacier range is a range of 5 glaciers, and the reason she wanted to take me to Jumbo is because this area had been is very politically important for this whole region. For the last 25 years, there's been a crew of developers that have been trying to create a new resort community up there. They want to basically make the Aspen of the north and have high altitude skiing. It's one of the few places you can ski all year round. Though you can see this picture. This is a picture of one of the glaciers. This is in the summer. It's not particularly good for skiing. There's lots of rocks and large crevasses, and yet they were going ahead with this. And so I said, sure, that'd be great. And so I said, can we, because she was interested in Northern Symphony, I thought, well, maybe I'll start doing another music score. I'd only done one music score between those pieces, even though I'd done other pieces that had sound. And I said, well, maybe I can write a piece for a larger ensemble, like maybe an orchestra or a choir or something. And then I had this idea to do a requiem, and a requiem for the Glacier. And so I started developing this piece, not really knowing where it was going to go. And shortly after getting the invitation and starting these talks, there was a press release from the BC government saying that the environmental assessment period was over and that they were going to approve this development. They were going to appoint a mayor and council to be the rulers of this non-existent community, and the taxpayers of British Columbia are going to have to pay for this government that we're not governing over anybody. And so I decided that I wanted to include that text somehow. And like a lot of my work, I kind of cast about. I don't really have. I've usually little bits and pieces of a concept, but I don't necessarily exactly know what I'm going to do. So I was sitting there and trying to figure out what to do. So I had these requiem texts. I got a hold of the liturgy and listened to a whole bunch of different requiems. And so I was like, these ones are all in Latin. I've got this press release. It's in English, but I think the English sounds too, propaganda-like. And so eventually I had this idea of translating it into Latin, and was able to get someone to translate it into Latin, which is fantastic. A fellow in Hungary that works at a scientific university, and he translated in 3 days and sent it back to me. And he was the associate of the guy that ended up conducting the requiem. And so that's the libretto. The basis of the libretto was this press release by the BC government proclaiming what a great job they did in consulting everybody and how everyone was happy. But none of these communities on either side of the Kootenai Mountains wanted this development, and neither did the Tanaka First Nations, who are, for them, this is a sacred spot. It's the resting place of the grizzly bears. It's where the grizzly bears go to dance. And it's also, biologically, it's very important. It's one of the connecting tracts of land remaining that connects different communities of grizzly bears in that area. So it is very, very important. And so on July 27th, 2013, we went up there and did this thing. Volunteer orchestra, a lot of environmental activists, students, curious musicians, and everyone agreed to do this. And they rehearsed for several months in Nelson and Caslow, and we showed up and did some rehearsals, and then I brought a crew of people with me. And unlike my other videos, you can probably tell with my other videos, I'm, like the nature of science, I'm taking a tripod and setting up and pressing record, and when it's done, it's done. And same with the drum video, the one with the drums in the rain, it's a single shot, no editing. I didn't know how to make video. In this situation, I brought a crew, and it wasn't until I got up there, there's 100 people. We had to bring Sherpas to carry stuff up there. Catering, we had to leave nothing up there, so we had to bring all the poop off the mountain and all this stuff. So it was a huge logistical thing. But when we got up there and everybody set up, all of a sudden someone said quiet on the set, and then someone pointed at me, and they were waiting for me to say action. And that's when I realized I was directing a video instead of just making a video. And so this was a whole new experience for me as well. So the footage that we shot up there became the basis of a video and sound installation. So some of the performances, field recordings from up there, a lot of shots of the surrounding landscape, and mixed in with some footage of the performers. I decided that I didn't want to make a music video. I wanted to create something else. So there's these performative vignettes that take place, and I'll show you at least one of those. Coming up, in which I staged some of the soloists to do things on their own and shot those separately. And so the performers are on screen for probably about 10% of the video. It's a 40-minute piece. And as Susan said, the piece just opened last night at the Ryerson Image Center in a wonderful exhibition called The Edge of the Earth, Photography and Video and Climate Change, or Climate Change and Photography and Video, something. Anyway, it's a really great show, and this is on the video wall there if anybody's interested in seeing it. It'll be up there until December. But I'll show you a couple clips. This is if anyone's interested in the technical side of it, is a 2K video installation. It's got two projectors that are side by side and kind of joined in the middle. It's kind of difficult to do. And it's taking two high definition video signals and combining them into the one video. That's the score. It's in different spaces. I get to do different things with this. In this case, this was in Quebec City, and they had extra space in the room, so I thought it would be nice to show the scores. I should talk a little bit about the scores. The score for this. The music was based on several things. There was a main theme in the first movement. It's a 4-movement oratorio. The first movement and part of the second movement uses the letters jumbo. So very simple, counting up from middle C up to J. So past, going up to C, going past G, and keep on going. And so using those letters, I wrote this little theme that they perform, and that takes place in the first and second movements. In the third movement, I used climactic temperature readings that I got from Environment Canada of that area. And so what happens is I used annual readings, so I got all the monthly data, translated it averaged it out to make a yearly temperature, and assigned a note to it. So, and I can't remember exactly, somebody asked me this the other day, said, how did you get the notes? I think it was all from 1/10 of a degree. So again, starting with middle C and moving up. And so what you hear over the course of that movement is gradually, there's fluctuations, the notes go up and down, but the overall trend is up. And so you can hear the temperature rising. And the last movement is based on carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide building up in the atmosphere, of course, is one of the major contributors to climate change, global warming. And so what happens in this piece is that it's using the note C and then counting up from C to O, and two of those, so it makes this little punctuated passage. And so it starts off very minimal, and gradually the whole orchestra joins in, but they're all doing it at different times, so it feels like this kind of large cacophonous buildup of this gas, or this, in this case, the sound. So it's trying to create an analogy with the sounds, what you're hearing and what you might imagine. So this is one of those performative vignettes. This is a lone horn player. So he performs by himself, and he appears and he sort of summons everybody up the mountain. And this is them performing. And this is another one with the soloist. So there was an opera singer who performed most of the solo vocals, and she does this lovely walk during that third movement. As it's playing this very slow, these annual notes, she's reading the British Columbia government's press release for the approval of the project. She climbs up the glacier. And then there's another scene with the composer, not the composer, conductor. And he's conducting to no one. And so this is a reference to the mayor that has no city. So he's leading these guys, what they're doing there. And so this is a little clip from the first movement. So that's how the piece begins. They start off down at the bottom of the mountain, and the horn player kind of summons them up, and then they end up here. And they're quite a long piece. This part goes on for about 15 minutes. So there's a couple things I want to say about that, about the duration, about using time. One of the things I liked about this piece, and it wasn't something I particularly planned, it was really after making it and seeing it and watching it and experiencing it that I realized that, you know, there aren't a lot of opportunities, especially in art. You know, you walk in, you see something, and you move on. One of the things that seemed to affect the audiences quite a bit was that there was this slowness to it, and it gave people time to think. And I think a lot of times in our lives today, we're answering emails, we're trying to do 5 things at once, and you know, everything's very, very fast-paced and on-demand. And you know, even walking into art galleries, you want to see the art and then go to the next gallery, and you know, just gallery hopping. And what was really nice about this piece is that people were staying and they were watching the whole thing and spending 40 minutes, and you know, gave people time to think. And so it's something that you know, after the first time, you know, when we were performing the piece, we sort of realized that. But then as the piece developed as an installation, I wasn't sure if it would translate, if that experience would translate into the gallery, and it was even more successful, I think, in that case, but in a very different way. And that's something I'm interested in as well. When we did the site-specific piece, we had one member of the media with us, but there was no audience. So the piece intentionally had no audience. We were performing for the Glacier. There was members of the crew, and so they sat there and watched it. Reporting the story that got written, it was originally supposed to be for the Nelson newspaper. It got picked up by the Vancouver Sun. It was on the front page of the Vancouver Sun. The next day I was driving back down from the mountain. I got a call from CBC. They wanted to do a story on it. Then it got picked up by Reuters, and it went all over the world. And so this all of a sudden this became the secondary experience of this piece. So, you know, this idea of doing something site-specific, and then it kind of generating its own audience or reception for the concept or the idea. And their slant on it was really, well, this is artists going protesting in the woods, or up in the bush and on this mountain. But it got the message out, and that was really interesting. And then as it moved into the gallery, it's a different audience. So it's getting a different kind of press and a different kind of reception and a different kind of audience. And I wanted to create a work that, you know, that was different than the kind of reception that, I mean, they've been protesting this thing for 25 years, and we're not getting on the front page of the Vancouver Sun. And I think part of it is, one of the limitations with the protest is that a protest is telling you what to think. You're saying, we're for this thing or we're against this thing. And we never did that. We deliberately never said we're for this thing or against this thing. We presented information, although in a rather abstract way, and allowed audiences to draw their own conclusion. And I think giving people time in the gallery to think those things is important to the experience. And so, you know, there's a social activist side to this piece, but we always, you know, and I say we because it was, you know, I had to work with a whole crew of people. I always tried to keep the art experience first and foremost, so that it didn't just fall back into protest. So here's another one. I think I'm gonna keep moving though, because we're. Should I show another clip or? All right, I'll show another clip. I've got one more kind of body work I want to share with you after this. So that's it for the Requiem. I'm going to talk about some new work. I just was on sabbatical and got to go up to Alaska. I was invited by the Anchorage Museum to go up to Anchorage, Alaska, and just like casual, I said, "Hey, I've never been to Anchorage before. That sounds like fun." And so I did 2 visits. I went up a year ago, February, and sort of wanted to visit some of the sights and sounds and get a sense of what we were going to do. And I had this big idea. I was going to shoot a feature film up there, and I got some grants to do that. And the Canadian dollar was worth so little by the time the residency came around this past February that we decided to switch gears. And so this is another kind of scoring. So my plan B was to enact a series of scores. Some of them, quite a few of them I'd previously written, and create a suite of works that was kind of like an album of videos that could work together. And so this is one of the pieces. So this kind of notation, sometimes it's called event scores, or word scores, or prose scores. This is one of the techniques that was developed in John Cage's composition class, and which the Fluxus artists are famous for. So Dick Higgins, Alison Knowles, Al Hansen, who else was in that class? Who's the Happiness dude? Alan Capro was in that class. Yeah, that's it. So they started doing these things, and it was a response. Cage asked them to make compositions, and most of them weren't music students, and they would write these things down, and they would sometimes perform them, and sometimes they didn't. But they realized that they could be visionary, and I like the relationship between these things and proposals. And I think proposals are kind of like a score. It's your own score for your own thing. And then you share these ideas, and so the ideas have a life in the proposal stage. And similarly, these things, a lot of Fluxus scores exist as things you can read, in a book. Like Yoko Ono's Grapefruit, you can read it. You could do them if you wanted, and it's not important necessarily that they be done. So this is one of these things, and I could do it or someone else could do it, but I decided to create a series of videos. Some of them I'm the performer, and other ones I've given them to other people. But I did a couple of realizations of this score, and one of them became this video, so I'm hoping this will work. I think I can scroll through this so we don't have to play the whole thing. No, it won't let me do that. So just play a little bit of it now. I apologize because I thought I could scroll through these, so we're going to have to watch a bit more of it than I intended. So this is kind of a little intro part, just to set the stage of where this thing's happening. And this is about an hour north of Anchorage at the Matanuska Glacier. So I love how this thing sounds, kind of, like radio static, or like when you drop a needle on a turntable, or when and it sounds a lot actually like an old Victrola. I don't know if anybody knows those old record players. They had an abrasive material right in the record that would sharpen the needle. So the needles were disposable, and you'd feel it before the record started. That's what it reminded me of. I also did another scored piece for an ensemble. So a lot of these things are responding to things that I saw out there. This is a small series of little small mountains that are right in the city of Anchorage, and at a park called Glen Alps, and so the piece is called Glen Alps. And I did a series of variations of this thing, but just looking at this landscape, it reminded me of the score. And so I put the staff across it, and then each grouping of trees and shrubs became a voice in the piece. So there's a string quartet, there's vocalists, and then all the kind of light colored bushes, those became percussion parts. And I used a combination, I translated the parts for the vocalist and the quartet into standard notation. So similarly in how someone would interpret a graphic notation, I did a little more systematically than that. So the exact spot on the staff and the exact spot along the mountain is where the notes fell. And the size of the tree related to the amplitude. And then I broke out the other trees into different sections, and then I gave those to the percussion players as graphic notations. And so they are performing that, and I'll play some of that video. I did a series of remixes as well of this, so we'll look at briefly at a couple of those after this. This little intro is a tie-in to another piece where I had a drum kit in the back of a car, and the car is driving up a mountain range, and the drums are bouncing around in the back of the car, and they're all heavily mic'd. So this is the car returning to town with the drums in the back. It's because these things were all shown in a series. It would be nice to tie these things together. They're performing this in an abandoned church, and I'd gone there to see a film screening, and I really liked the space. They use it, an artist collective uses it for studio space, and so I got to access to the space, and this projection behind them, and it's this really old DLP projector. You can kind of see it scrolling. And then what attracted me to the space was every time a car drove by, you could see the lights illuminate the windows. This piece recycles a couple of ideas. You know, it's this what I was doing in Northern Symphony, this translation of information from nature into a score. It's using graphic notation, which I'd used previously, and one of the ideas from the Requiem was this idea of using Latin. So I used the Latin names of the trees. And the connection to climate change is that as there's massive climate change going on in Alaska, so they're heating up 3 times as fast as, the Arctic's heating up 3 to 6 times as much, but we're there, it's about 3 times as fast as everywhere else, so it's really quite warm. And what's happening is the trees are slowly moving up the mountain. So there are no, this is kind of a snapshot of what they were like then. If we went back there 5 years from now, they'll be further up the mountain. And so it's destroying or changing this ecology. There's trees that have adapted to be at this specific altitude because of the temperature, and that's all changing now. So I want to make a piece about that. It's sort of obliquely reference all the stuff that's going on. So these guys all have notation, except for the percussionists. They have that picture in front of them, and they're playing the trees that are in their part of the picture. This is, scrolling across at the same speed as the score. So I did a couple of remixes. I'm going to play the second one. This will work. I think this is the right one. Let's see. So because the mountain is the way it is, there's really no forwards and backwards. So at some point I decided I wondered what it would sound like backwards. So this whole video is just a whole score playing backwards. Within the context of the installation, it's kind of the middle of the installation. So we kind of build up to this scene of the performers, and then also we get to this part and it goes backwards, and then a series of other videos that leads to this mashup of all the videos at the very end. So we have time for one more? Okay, I'll do one more. I'll skip over the dance. They're not on my website yet, but some of these will be on my website soon. There are excerpts of them. I want to end it with this one. So this goes right back to the first slide that I showed. I decided I wanted to go back and revisit some of these ideas. And one of the things I discovered up there was that moose chew on trees. And I'd never seen that before. And they kind of climb up the trees a bit and then make these markings on the trees that were very similar to the kinds of things that first attracted me to doing this kind of work. And I tried to photograph these things, and there was no way to capture. The marks are so big, there was no way for me to capture it in one shot, without them being very, very small. And when I saw them, I thought, wow, this would make a great score, and how could I do this? So what I ended up having to do was sort of climb up close to the trees with this camera and pan down the trees. And so I realized that there was no way for me to make single photographs that were going to work. So what I did was edit the video so that the video became the score. And I worked with a guy from New York named Alex Waterman, and he's a cello player. And when I was looking at this thing, I thought, Alex could really do this. I've heard him play. He's a beautiful cello player. And he's also an expert in graphic notation. He has a PhD on graphic notation. And so I knew that Alex would know what to do, and so I gave him pretty explicit instructions of how to interpret the marks, very similar to the kind of instructions that went into interpreting the mushroom spore piece. And so what you're going to hear is Alex Waterman's interpretation of these moose gnaws.